I think Bhutan is unique. I thought I was the only person who had realized that today is the 8th of January, and I'm glad that, but Michael referred to it in the morning, the Treaty of Punakha, although I may give you a different view of things. I think that it's really interesting that Bhutan is perhaps the only place on this planet with an elected monarchy and a democracy that came about in the country at the behest of the monarch at a time when a referendum on the desirability of the transition to democracy would have failed. So I think that in itself is no mean feat. I think also, I must tell you this, from my own experience of Bhutan, I think it's probably the only place on this planet where people take their spiritual health really seriously. Almost everyone, especially spiritual health, and I think that reflects in all sorts of endeavors. So Bhutan is unique. I'm especially pleased and honored to be speaking at Oxford on Bhutan. I have been here and spoken previously on economics and on Kashmir, but never on Bhutan, so this is especially a privilege. So what is my paper going to be about? It's too long, and whatever I can't say, please just ask me in the questions, like what else were you going to say? So everything that this paper draws upon is in the public domain. It's archives, it's books, it's things that are out there. And although I will not be able to go into the references, I'm very happy to direct you to the specific microfilm or the file or the book or the text where I'm sourcing my things from. This paper really comes out of not what I have recently been doing in relation to Bhutan, which is looking at the transition to democracy, and then 10 years on, that is a separate thing, and hopefully at the next conference I'll tell you more of my current work. So this goes back, and it actually grew from thinking about, from being deeply invested in trying to understand the transition, and then thinking, okay, I want to know more about the backstory of this place, and that's where it comes from. I also think it's rather interesting that on 8th of January 2019, a person who's Kashmiri by origin, British by nationality, and Bhutanese at heart will tell you this story. And I think that it's also interesting that we are in Oxford, which is where James Hilton's pilot went out from to find his Shangri-La. So we're going to do this a little bit of a sort of speaking back kind of a thing. The kind of backdrop of this paper is that it's about interrogating the epistemology of geopolitics, by which I mean that the conventional geopolitical stories and how we've got them, and this is an attempt to sort of subalternize that and say, okay, we've heard a lot of stories from the big countries downwards point of view. I'm interested in looking at this story from the small country upwards. And for those of you who know disciplines like history and several other disciplines in the last few decades, you would know that the subaltern tradition, the post-colonial tradition, and post-colonial doesn't mean that you have to be colonized. It's really just a way of being critical about the way in which the larger states in the world have functioned. So in all of those traditions, the idea of the subaltern is to turn the standard narratives around and say, okay, how would we see this story if we looked at it from Bhutan upwards rather than from India downwards or Europe downwards or Britain downwards. This is all, of course, meant in good faith. The idea here is not to say there are bad actors and bad intentions. It's meant to draw attention to what I'm trying to do here is, to borrow a phrase, reconstellate a genealogy for you, to kind of put the points together somewhat differently in order to spotlight the things that we might have missed. And it also, I think, partly what it helps us do is draw attention to the polyvocality of history, that there isn't just the one history, there are histories, and in the Bhutan context, in small country context, that's really important. So along the way, you would see that I would question some conventional narratives, but also because I think that in the 21st century, as we see globally a move towards the old conventional geopolitics, I think it is important to sort of move forward from some of those realpolitik paradigms and try to look at this a bit differently. Now, two parts. The summary, in case I can't get through it. The two, the two very radical statements that all of this paper is about. One, Bhutan exists. That it exists, and secondly, the idea that Bhutan isn't just in between India and China, or in between this and that, or in between something and something else. So those are really just, and within that critical geopolitical tradition, that's what I look to be arguing. So I want to begin by saying that there is a wide I will read. There is a wide chasm between Bhutan as it is viewed in history and politics, and Bhutan's history and politics. I think that in the broad brush narratives of conventional geopolitics and international relations, often with an imperial hangover, imperial here doesn't just refer to Britain, but also to so ostensibly post-imperial countries like India. Small countries, especially when they are of non-Western provenance, are often denied agency in the shaping of the wider history. The trajectory of the policies, politics, and plans of such small countries are seen merely as a reaction to the maneuverings of the big countries around them. This has a negative effect of giving us a big power view of history on everything, where everything has come about as a result of carefully orchestrated intentions and agendas. Now, in practice, and this line is important, history is a contested story, produced in part by determined leadership, but also by accidental individuals, conflicting agendas, abandoned intentions, and an irreducible element of chanciness in countries both big and small. And in this Bhutan story, I think I want to argue that has been the case. So firstly, the idea that, the Bhutan exists. Of course, it exists. But look, when we describe a place, we are not merely saying that it is here. We are also locating it in our imagination. There's also an imaginary geography that's involved. So you may want to ask yourself, when somebody says something about Switzerland, you don't say Switzerland is a small country located between country A and country B. Or, think of other countries that you wouldn't use that way of describing that country. It's not the first thing that would come to your mind when you talk about Switzerland. But it is very often, including to people I just randomly was speaking to this morning, not connected to the conference, the first way in which people see Bhutan. So that means, and that has its own implications, and and I want to sort of excavate the history of that. So Bhutan has often been described as wedged, landlocked, nestled, located, situated, stuck between, it's that whole way of looking at it as a strategic buffer state only. Why does this happen? And this part I won't go into that much detail, but I think historically it happens because most of our knowledge of Bhutan, this is of course not including Bhutanese scholars who have not been, widely echoed as much, or people who are writing on religion, humanities, arts. I'm not talking of that. Talking more of politics and IR, with few exceptions such as Karmaura, Solankinga, Das Chakrabarti, and a few others. But most of the stories, most of the understanding that we have of Bhutan comes through two kinds of narrative: travel and strategy. So it's literally as if the place of Bhutan has been cut on the map by a scissors that has travel on one end and strategy on the other. What that means is that, of course, travelers have reasons for why they tell the story that they tell. And there have been many travelers. The first written reference to Bhutan was in, as you might know, was by Ralph Fitch in a collection dated, this is quoted in Riley. I'll stop doing this because otherwise it'll take forever. Was by Ralph Fitch, which draws upon Hakluyt's account from 1598 to 1600. This entire account was based on hearsay, and some of the things it said about the people of Bhutan was that they were able to see the sea from where they were, they had very big ears, and so on and so forth. And if somebody didn't have big ears, then they thought they were apes. And so you can tell that the exotic idea of the other, it's not just Bhutan, it's everywhere. That's how modernity comes about. Our encounters with others that we haven't previously known. Now, of course, the key thing here is, and then the Jesuit missions, the Coachella and Cabral missions of the 17th century, the various British missions, Bogle in 1774, Hamilton in 75 and 77, Turner in 1783, Bose in 1815, Pemberton in 1837-38, Eden in 1864, White in 1905, and in 1907, and a few people in between that were not referred to because they were not official missions. So in all of this, the idea that Bhutan is somehow isolated, didn't have a history before we found it, is actually not the case at all. The isolation as the in-betweenness of Bhutan, both of these things have come to be accepted as narratives over time. There are also accounts by various British and other later Indian travelers, which, some of which were even denied publication, like I'm thinking of something I found in the archives, an Indian cameraman. So these accounts have their own way of constructing that story. Curzon in 1898 described the origin of power in the British Empire, saying, there were merchant explorers and there was a casual stone that was thrown into the waters and the ripples just made the world. It's not entirely incorrect to say that that is to an extent the case. However, I think it would be naive to ignore the systematicity of modernity. That the way in which the rest of the world has come to be known to us is through a systematic understanding of knowledge and its link to profit, and profit, various kinds of profit, value, the commerce of storytelling as well as the commerce of goods. Okay. So this systematicity, the systematic disentangling and classification of people, objects, lands, customs, and the systematic reordering of the world almost always proceeded as if there was no ordering that previously existed. Now, for example, if we look at Ward, and he narrates, going to Lunana, and he describes like what he sees in Lunana, and if we look at those findings even today, it's he says that on most things, air quality, forestation, life space, diet, health, intelligence, the people that Ward surveyed were coping rather well, even by today's standards. So he refers to all of these things. Now, the thing with this kind of view of the other, the Orient that we've had, is that one often gets the view that Bhutanese are some kind of noble savages in a Rousseau's kind of, in a Rousseau sort of pedigree, that these perfect people, which is of course not the case. But by saying that Bhutan was always isolated, inaccessible, has a static past, no ferment of ideas, it denies Bhutan its existence in history. And also it allows for the creation of a security imperative that means that Bhutan can be modernized for the security of those around it. And I think that is often missed. Another thing I would like to tell you before I move on is that even people like, I'm referring to someone called Coelho, who says Bhutan's uneventful, and in his remarks, but he does say, he notes the democratic spirit prevalent in everyday Bhutan, and I quote, "In their own special way, they have a voice in their government. They hold opinions and make them known in no uncertain manner as to what should or should not be done. This kind of democracy or such democratic methods have no parallel elsewhere." Likewise, Ward also says, before any decision is taken, the GUPs call a meeting and speak to everyone together. These are books from decades ago, so it's well prior to the official democracy. However, at the same time, travelers do end up saying things like there were 500,000 people in Paro. Why would they say there were 500,000 people in Paro? You've got to ask that. Did they, when the Jesuits went along, did they hardly see any places of worship, even after journeying the land for days on end? So there are all these kinds of questions that we ask, and what they reveal to us is that these accounts are not a textual picture of Bhutan as it was, and we should treat that as such. So these questions give us a sense of how we cannot read the stability of meaning into these historical textual accounts. And one particular way in which that manifests itself, especially in the 19th century, is this rhetoric of what I will refer to two things. In the context of the British case, it's this unfair but not unreasonable argument. And in the Indian case, it's that taking a greater interest in a smaller neighbor argument. So the unfair but not unreasonable argument is this sort of, is this almost repeated narrative that one finds in all of the accounts, where one says, and when I say the British, I don't of course mean to situate a monolithic entity. The empire in London is different from the British Indian officials in India, which is different from the political officer, which is different from the person on the street. So there are various levels and polyvocality, as I said. So this unfair but not unreasonable argument goes along thus. Something unfair has happened. It is unfair, but on the other hand, it's not entirely unreasonable, so we can somehow let it go. And you see this most kind of at its sharpest when you look at the difference between the statements of, say, Ashley Eden and Jigme Namgyal. But it's also a repeated trope through various instances. The other thing to note is the way in which foreign policies are structured by representations. So the view of Bhutanese appreciates and depreciates. It's the same people, but the idea of how we see who the Bhutanese are changes along the centuries. So, in 1774, Hastings found simplicity, strong sense of religion, which preserved the Bhutanese from vices, virtues of humor and trust and goodwill. In 1783, Turner said positive impressions of the Bhutanese, but Eden found them idle, indifferent. Even the mules were fidgety. I found this sort of, even the mules are fidgety. And monotonous and noisy. So this is of course not unique to Bhutan and not unique to this case, but I think it is important to note, and it also has bearing in the present, that for other countries that engage with Bhutan, our perceptions of a nation or people often change in line with the wider objectives of which we are a part. By, in the 18th century, the appreciation is different. By the High Noon of Empire, the appreciation changes, and likewise, after 1947, there are several successive changes too. I have what? No. Seriously? Oh my God. Okay, right.
Pick the most important conclusions.
Oh, honestly, you're not kidding me. I thought we were just joking. Sorry. Okay. Right. Let me move to the second part of the argument. This is the part of the argument where I really... Okay, let me just go to the... So in 1947, at the Asian Relations Conference, the Bhutanese representative introduced himself to the gathered members and said, as a representative of Bhutan, a small country perched up in the Himalayas, I offer you fraternal greetings, etc. Small country perched up in the Himalayas. Did not say between India and China. I can quote any number of other references that only refer to Bhutan as in between India and China. This in-betweenness, and since I have two minutes, this gradually Bhutan was produced as being in between, but it went from being seen as what is it in between of? From north of Cooch Behar to south at the time of Renal, to south of Tibet for Gogol, to in between Assam and Nepal trade routes to Tibet from Bengal, from Hastings onwards, to in between British India and an impenetrable Tibet in the 19th century, courtesy the native explorers and the spies, to in between India and the game territory of Tibet and beyond, from Young Husband onwards, to the start of the 20th century, to in between India and Tibet, from the until mid-20th century, to in between India and China, from 1950s onwards, to being landlocked in a belt between democratic India and a communist China, from 1960 onwards. So this idea of what it is in between of also changes over time. And just to summarize, maybe you can ask me about this later, is that I look at this through a set of imperatives. The territorial imperative, of course. And on that, I would completely agree with scholars like Ura and others who've said that for almost every transaction contracted Bhutan. But secondly, the idea of economic imperative, as it was related to profit maximization, and initially through commercial advantage, then through cultivation, security, a kind of a paternalistic use of medical aid, economic aid, not just by the British, but subsequently by the Indians, and that is something, again, that is an ongoing story. It's also interesting to place this in the wider context of the friendship dialogue, which is actually, I think, a really good model. But it also allows us to reflect on, there are things that friends may forget, which neighbors might remember. So I think friendship is actually a good glue to organizing this asymmetric in-betweenness. And of course, finally, with the inequality, because for smaller countries, I think it's really interesting how the same kinds of rights don't often translate into the same kinds of translation of those rights into action. Is there anything else that I'm absolutely dying to tell you? Well, pretty much everything, but I have to also see this in the context of what has been happening in the making of modernity, right? The double entry bookkeeping mechanisms, the idea, understanding of rights, which is where the epistemology of geopolitics part comes in. Like, how do we distinguish between symbolic and actual value? How do you go from a system where you can pay for something with prayers to a system where you can't pay for something with prayers? You have to pay for it in money or some kind of monetary transactions. Strategic ambiguities, I think, with if you look at the south of Bhutan and the north of Bhutan, the in-betweenness comes actually, and it's something we see ongoing even now, in the way in which I think the Great Game was a kind of proto-Cold War, and we see that that kind of strategic consideration continues to, I think, pose a difficulty for small countries. And I think there should be a word called Bhutan brand of diplomacy, because it's just so unique. I mean, I would like to absolutely end, and I promise I am absolutely ending here, with actually Sonam Deshmukh book, which just came out, The Story of a Raven. It's really beautiful. It's about a small boy who wants to know more about the Bhutanese constitution. And he dreams of a raven. I just got it, in fact, recently, 2 weeks ago. He dreams of a raven coming to him and telling him the story of the constitution. And and then he goes to the class the next day and he asks his teacher, like, what does this constitution mean? Who are we? What does it mean for us to be a nation? And the teacher says, okay, look, the teacher calls two other students. Kado is India and Chanda is China. They both stand there with their fists, right? They pump their fists in the air. And Bhutan, which is Singhe, is in the middle. And the idea is, yes, of course Bhutan feels intimidated by these two big powers that are next to it. But that is why its own cultural resources are so significant. And that is why it is important that the student learns to understand the weaknesses, but also to strengthen the strengths. This is really, I think, more than anything else, about turning over some of those conventional geopolitical paradigms to say, okay, what if we actually gave the small countries agency? What if we started to think of these places as if they were not merely sort of looking down upon, but their own internal creative adjustments of how they come to successfully be. And I think that it's a good example of Bhutan is incredibly interesting to study for that reason. And also in the way in which the last 10 years democracy has been indigenized, I think also ties in with that story. Thank you, sorry.
Natasha, thank you so much.